Right. So anyway, today's lecture, like I said, I'm going to talk about industrialization mostly, which takes off in Britain and Europe and then eventually spreads to the rest of the world. It kind of affects a lot of people throughout the world. Even, of course, the United States, I'll kind of talk a little bit about some of the industrialization that we had as well. Rise of socialism, I'll get to that because that is something that does start in kind of in the mid to late 1800s. So I'll talk about that as well because that's kind of something that's kind of controversial later, because of what happens with communism, in the 20th century, like the rise of these states like the Soviet Union, we have later. Anyway, like I said, I'm going to talk about the background first of the Industrial Revolution, which really the Industrial Revolution starts, you can go back to the 18th century, I think is when it really starts. Although most countries, like I know United States, we really didn't start to really industrialize a lot until the 19th century. Most of Europe didn't really get to industrialize the most till the 1800s overall. But the Industrial Revolution was primarily an innovation, really, with a lot of countries' economies, where they went more towards commercial, production of goods, with like early capitalism. And Great Britain, like especially England and Scotland, those were the areas that first really industrialized. And then, of course, Western Europe as well as it spread, throughout, Europe from there into the world. So yeah, those were the first real major countries that really got industrialized overall. And you start to see this transition where they start moving towards using like machines, new kinds of inventions start to be developed by the 1800s. Chemical iron production is something else that you start seeing as well. Steam power, coal being used, like different kinds of new kinds of fuel, petroleum later also as well. Water, electrical power. You start to see that being used besides steam. Use of machines, tools, development of factories, assembly lines, those kind of things you start to see. So all kinds of new processes of mass production is some of the things that you start really seeing, during the Industrial Revolution. Large scale manufacturing. So all these kind of things are things that really start to kind of advance, start in the 18th century, but become more advanced by the 1800s, of course, 19th century overall. The Industrial Revolution does have like two phases to it. They always talk about, if you know about this, the first Industrial Revolution really started in Britain first, like England and Scotland. So cities like London, Birmingham, etc., start to really advance, industrialize. And you see changes in agriculture that kind of also spur on that as well. And then later you do have another industrial revolution. They usually call it the Second Industrial Revolution, which starts around the mid part of the 19th century and goes up to like World War I. And so you see industrialization start to spread to other parts of Europe, as far away as Russia, of course, Germany, France, of course, the Americas, especially the United States, Canada, and then, of course, eventually to Asia. I think the British influenced industrialization in India. Japan, I think, is one of your first countries that really starts to industrialize also as well. But I'm going to first talk about some of the influences that really lead into, of course, industrialization. One here I'm going to blow up, of course, which was pretty influential, was the agrarian revolutions that happened worldwide, like Britain, America, and other places overall. Kind of blow this up for you right here. But the British agricultural revolution, that's usually considered to be one of the main things that really leads into industrialization, starting in the 1800s. So, yeah, Britain goes through this agricultural revolution, and there were a lot of causes of it that really led to it, of course, later. And I'll kind of discuss this a little bit, but you can see there's several things like the enclosure movement. It's considered one of the main things that they always talk about as a major influence on why it occurred. What happened in Britain was they went away from the so-called open field system, where in medieval times, pretty much they would have deals where some fields would lay fallow during the growing season, and then some that they would grow and things like that. And but that wasn't efficient because over time you get this population boom that starts in Britain and other countries, and so they're forced to basically produce more crops and things like that. And so in Britain they started to enclose all the land, and so it led to all these larger farms that were developed like in England, and they had to create more efficient farms to grow crops. And so what happened was they believed that because of the better agricultural practices, it basically led to, you know, it cut down on labor and labor costs, things like that. And so uh, because you had a surplus of workers, that meant that all these workers had to find work somewhere else. And so they went to, the cities. The cities became industrialized, and that led to urbanization. And so that's supposedly how the Industrial Revolution started, because of the agricultural revolution. So not too many people farm much anymore. I know in my uncle's side of the family, they still farm. I know out in Point Capique Parish, they have about a few thousand acres of land that they farm, usually soybeans, I think it is. But primarily, it's mostly agribusiness today, because everything's mechanized and things like that. They of course developed different kinds of inventions that really led to it. You may have heard of Jethro Tull. He was a famous English farmer around the turn of the 18th century. He was one of the first English farmers that really helped to kind of change agriculture in modern England at the time. And he invented this mechanical machine called the seed drill, supposedly around 1701, that basically made farming a lot easier. And so instead of planting seed by hand, they did it mechanically. Tull was also known for developing some kind of mechanical hoe as well. And so this helped to cut time in half, and obviously cut labor as well, and make farming a lot faster and more efficient and things like that. You may have heard of Jethro Tull, because Jethro Tull is a famous rock band. Yeah. You may have heard about that. Yeah. Joyce saying, yeah, a lot of sugar cane is right. Iberville Parish, as well. So yeah. So in fact, my mom's side of the family come from like a family of farmers, pretty much, about that. So so yeah, that's a good example of that. Other innovations they talk about too, we call it like scientific farm. You get the scientific farming, taking off. So mechanized equipment, fertilizers, new kinds of chemicals, selective breeding of cattle, something you start seeing by the 18th, 19th century. Oh, and new crop rotation systems was something that also came about because of the agricultural revolution as well. You got here the four-core system, or the Norfolk four-core system. It's called different names, known after Norfolk County in England back in the 1600s. But it was a new type of crop rotation system that Charles Townshend kind of helped to popularize. Townshend was an English farmer, an agriculturalist, and he got farmers to use different kinds of, I guess they call them fodder crops, basically, to help revitalize the soil. And so things like turnips were used, clover, ryegrass, and other kinds of feeds. And so they would rotate the different crops with different parts of the field. So you can see here, some parts of the season, barley and wheat would be grown, and then they would rotate it every year with the fodder crops you're looking at there. And I think Charles Townshend had a nickname. He was called Turnip Townshend or something like that, because turnips was one thing that they began feeding cattle and things like that. So you get new types of crop rotation systems. I think my uncle's side of the family sometimes will rotate wheat sometimes instead of like soybeans. So as an example. Um, There, of course, there's Townsend, of course, we're talking about. By the way, yeah, it could be alfalfa, other things that they could use. I think peanuts and sweet potatoes and things like that were kind of made popular. George Washington Carver, you have heard of him? He kind of helped to kind of popularize those kind of crops, I know, in the American South, etc. Of course, John Deere, you may have heard of him. I think everybody's heard of John Deere, famous American farm equipment manufacturer in the 1800s. He was one of the first to mass produce like plows, like iron and I guess later steel plows. And so John Deere's famous for his company. Of course, later they're famous for developing things like tractors and combines and other things, which most of their equipment is usually, of course, green looking color. You've seen before, maybe. Also, they had like International Harvester. These are mostly American companies that are kind of famous. Like International Harvester is another one. Cyrus McCormick, I think everybody's heard of him. He, of course, was known for up in like I think in Illinois, manufacturing a lot of new kinds of equipment, and their tractors and combines and other machines, cultivators and so on, were had kind of a red color to it overall. So you may have seen their tractors or whatever. I guess competition there, green versus red. So yeah, I think I mentioned earlier how like this man named Robert Bakewell. They consider him in the 18th century. He helped to develop some of the first selective breeding of cattle, like sheep and other animals. And so that's something you start to see where they try to breed the best bull with the cows and things like that to produce better animals, and so on. So that's something you start seeing in things like that. But I'll use like chemicals, manure, super phosphates, and other things to produce better crops like fertilizers. I'll get first next. I want to, of course, talk about the first industrial revolution, kind of some different inventions that were kind of well known. One of the first industries you really start seeing that really takes off the most by the 18th, 19th centuries is textiles. Textile industry, like where they produce like cotton and other things into cloth, and they think that the textile industry started because of population booms, population explosions that started like in Europe and the Americas. And so they had to find more ways to produce cloth a lot faster. And so before, they in the old days, they would just produce cloth by hand, like spinning wheels or whatever. And so if you know much about the 18th century, John Kay, who was an Englishman. He invented this invention called the flying shuttle. The flying shuttle was considered the first major innovation of the textile industry. It really revolutionized it. It also eliminated a lot of labor costs because, before that, like women would mostly work at home with spinning wheels. In this case, it only took like one person to operate this machine, which I think a lot of the early ones were kind of hand crank models and later were mechanical on some kind of power. And so that was one of the first major inventions. And a lot of these inventions, like the flying shuttle, are still used worldwide. I want to say in Asia, they still use them, but they're still around. Also, another famous textile invention is the spinning jenny, which was invented by James Hargreaves in 1764. This was a more advanced weaving machine or loom that was one of the first to incorporate a wheel, which you can see like a wheel, which I think he got the idea from a spinning wheel. And this helped to basically produce more cloth over time, which you see 6 to 8 times more faster than the flying shuttle. And it was called the spinning jenny because of the spinning wheel. And then he named it after his wife, I think, Jenny Hargreaves, and hence the name being used. So that's like the first one that, like I said, incorporates some kind of spinning wheel that makes it move faster. But they had other ones later, like the power, like the water frame, which was invented by Richard Arkwright in the 1760s. That one was considered one of the first that was powered by some kind of thing like water power, water wheels, because a lot of factories or cotton mills and things like that were usually put near some kind of water source, like a river or stream. And this textile loom, by the way, was really one of the first they started using in factories. You know much about Richard Arkwright. Arkwright was considered to be one of the fathers of the textile industry in England. He started producing some of the first cotton mills in the 1770s, which used the water frame. And a lot of the workers at first didn't like it because, if you know about it, a lot of these, making of cloth was done at home, like by women or whatever. But these factories started to put people out of business. And so there were cases where some people tried to sabotage them early on, where they would take their wooden shoes called a sabot or sabot, they would throw it at the machines and try to break it. So hence the word sabotage being used later. But yeah, they do have like early textile mills. Like there's this one right here, Derwent Valley Mills, which I believe Arkwright must have been the one that first created this. It was one of the first major textile mills that was built in the 1700s, late 18th century. And so Derbyshire, England. So a lot of these factories start sprouting up all over the place, England and other countries, America, and so on. Although I think the textile industry in America didn't start till the 1790s, which is why Eli Whitney was, I guess, doing his thing later. They had other inventions. Here's, of course, the famous water wheel or water turbine. They think that was considered a very important invention that helped a lot of factories and mills, not just cotton mills, but I guess mills that dealt with like making lumber, etc., or grain and grinding grain and so on. And so, yeah, the water wheel has been around. It goes back to ancient times. So you go back to like the time of the Egyptians or the Greeks. And so that's kind of been around, but they would incorporate this into modern times and use it into different types of industrial works. There were other machines like this one by Samuel Crompton, invented in 1779, called the spinning mule. It was like a hybrid version of like the spinning jenny in the water frame. They kind of became kind of popular, which it was. I think they say it was one of the most popular machines they used for like making cloth between the 18th and the 20th century, believe it or not. So you have other versions like that one. But the one they always talk about that's really considered the most famous one is Edmund Cartwright's power loom, which was invented in the 1780s. That one ended up being the most efficient one and most influential because apparently it influenced a lot of other variations of it that come later, which are still used today throughout the world to make cloth. I think it was first powered by steam and then now obviously electrical power. But that was an invention that he invented that's well known. Edmund Cartwright. Now, of course, they were talking about that short video, Eli Whitney, of course, who invented the cotton gin. Whitney was an inventor, engineer that was pretty educated, went to Yale University in the Northeast. And of course, he started inventing this machine, the cotton gin, because the fact that in the 1790s, cotton, became kind of popular at that time. But the only thing was, it was very time consuming because the fact that you had to take the seed out of the cotton boll. And so Eli Whitney invented this contraption that would, remove the seeds mechanically and all that. And of course, it made him some profit for a while, but they didn't really go into that in the video. But 1812, he lost the patent to it. So he wasn't allowed to renew it and all that. So he didn't really make much money on it in the end. And so Whitney was more known for developing, like I said, interchangeable parts, especially with developing like muskets and guns. That's kind of what he's more known for overall. But yeah, the only bad thing about the cotton gin was that it actually, they say it was supposed to be invented to actually help get rid of slavery, believe it or not. But in the end, it did the opposite. It made slavery more popular in the United States and the South. Cotton is king, they used to say back in the 19th century. But over time, they say it's one of the major causes of the American Civil War, which breaks out in the 1860s. Yeah, here's a larger version, of course, of the cotton gin. But they're still used today, cotton gins, and of course, his thing on interchangeable parts probably in the end was the thing that really influenced people more than anything worldwide, mechanically. Now, of course, the other thing they always talk about, I will get into that, really helped revolutionize the Industrial Revolution was the steam engine, which the steam engine, by the way, was considered to be the greatest invention of the 18th century. The 1700s, for the 1800s come later. And if you know much about steam engines, they were first used in coal mines, believe it or not. In fact, a lot of steam engines were known as, they're called atmospheric steam engines because they would convert water into steam to remove water from the bottom of coal mines. That's why they originally created it, steam engines. In fact, the first one was developed was a man by Thomas Newcomen called the Newcomen engine that was developed in 1712, which was primarily used in coal mines. So that was the initial one, of course. But this man named James Watt, a Scottish inventor at the University of Glasgow, who was an engineer, he invented one of the first practical steam engines in 1769, later called the Watt steam engine or different names. And you can see that image on the left. His steam engine became more practical. It used, of course, obviously steam power with cylinders to produce, horsepower to move things. And so Watt became very wealthy because of this invention. And I think I've got images of the Watt engine. I think his initial engine was very not that powerful. I think the initial first engines they invented had like 10 horsepower, which horsepower is a term that Watt invented to compare his engines to the amount of horses in power wise. But later Watt engines by the 1880s had 10,000 horsepower to give you an idea of the evolution of these engines that start out in the 1710s, like over a period of like more than a century or whatever. So the Watt engine was very important. Of course, most of them ran on coal, which coal was the big thing, fuel-wise back in the 18th, 19th century. I guess before petroleum and other things came along later to replace that. But over time, what happened was they then took the steam engine and they started using it in other areas, industries or whatever. That helped to revolutionize things all over the world. And so Robert Fulton, who's actually an American engineer, entrepreneur, was one of the first to develop what we call commercial steamships, or some people call it steamboats, if you want, which he developed one called the Claremont, which he developed in the early 1807, I think was when it was completed. And a lot of the early steamships used paddle wheels to basically propel ships instead of sails using coal. And a lot of them used high pressure steam engines. Of course, were used on that and also on locomotives later. So here's an early, type of steamship that were developed. And eventually over time, that's going to lead to the end of the age of sail. The age of sail ends in the 1800s, and you'll start to see propellers being used and things like that on ships, propulsion, so on. They say Fulton was also one of the first to develop like submarines, which in the old days they called submarines submersibles. And this is one of the first that was developed called the Nautilus, you may have heard of, which he designed and built around 1800. And I think initially Robert Fulton built it to sell the submersible to Napoleon, who had trouble fighting against the British Navy and all that, I guess, to sink their ships. And you can see it has a propeller on the end, which is interesting about that. So you can see propellers maybe go back to the early 1800s, the idea of propulsion over, say, a paddle wheel or a stern wheel or whatever they have. But steamships become big, on the Mississippi River, of course, in the United States. But steamships are big, even crossing the Atlantic and going around the world. Then they have the locomotive that they have as well, which next came, which, if you know about this in the 19th century, most industrialized countries start having railroads throughout their countries to advance their economies. Richard Trevithick, who was a British engineer, he was one of the first to invent the first locomotive, which he built in 1804, which ran on iron rails. Actually, the name of his contraption he built, which used a high-pressure steam engine, was called Catch Me Who Can. And its top speed, you can see, was only 6 miles per hour, but it could pull about 25 tons in weight, which was, I guess, pretty impressive for that time. But by the 1800s, a lot of people started to call it the Iron Horse, if you know about that, because I guess it was as fast as a horse or faster. It was made out of iron. I know Native American Indians called it the Iron Horse. I think it was another name. I know where it kind of came from, but I know in the United States that was a nickname they called sometimes locomotives, the Iron Horse. And of course, railroads start to be built first in England back in the 19th century. They say one of the first that built the first railroad was a man named George Stephenson, who was an Englishman entrepreneur. He and his son Robert Stephenson built a lot of railroads in locomotives. First to be built, by the way, was the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which was completed in 1830. It was one of the first railroads that linked up like two cities together. So that's going to be kind of important, of course, with the development of railroads. You'll see railroads, of course, being developed in other countries, like in the United States, in other countries throughout the world overall. There's Stephenson. Stephenson does have a nickname. They often called him the father of the railways. It's a nickname because of the fact that he was one of the first to build, a railroad, obviously. But Stephenson was also one of the first to invent what they call the standard gauge rail system for railroads, where he used like a type of standard gauge, like the width of the rails. And so that's primarily where that came from. And he and his son, he had a son named Robert Stephenson. They started manufacturing locomotives in England. And they say one of the first that they produced, called the Rocket, which you see in that picture right there, which was, I guess, completed around 1829, was considered one of the first major locomotives that was constructed. That was like a prototype to other ones later. So a lot of other locomotives copied that particular one that you're looking at. You got different types of rails which are used on railroads today overall. The standard gauge is about, if you want, 4 feet, 8.5 inches wide, or if you want it in millimeters, 1,435 millimeters, the width, like between each track and or each rail. But you can see there's different ones. I think 2/3 of the world's railroads use the standard gauge overall. And then the other one after that they use a lot is like a type of narrow gauge rails as well. But most railroads, I think, at least in the United States, pretty much a majority of them use standard gauge rails. Makes you want to go out and just measure it and see nearby railroad. But anyway, yeah, there's the width, of course, you're looking at. But of course, at first they made the rails out of iron, which was kind of dangerous because they weren't strong enough to keep some locomotives on the track because a lot of would derail if you know about this. And then along came the development of mass-produced steel, which is something they started to produce around the mid part of the 19th century. Yeah, the mass production of steel was developed by this man named Henry Bessemer in England. Bessemer was a English entrepreneur and steel manufacturer, and he was one of the first to build large size furnaces and steel mills that could convert molten pig iron into steel. And it's done by using mostly carbon, if you know about this, like carbonized iron, which is steel. And they call it carburizing, I think is the proper term that they use. And they use these huge furnaces. They call them a Bessemer converter later. That's what they dub it. And you have to melt, like steel, I think melts at a high temperature of like 3,200 degrees, 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit, or if you want the Celsius, I think it's 1,700 range. So they have to really melt these up to really high temperatures and also burn off any kind of materials in it that are no good. So that's something that was developed by, in England first. And then if you know about it, Andrew Carnegie, who was originally from Scotland, had come to America, Pittsburgh area, and he helped develop his own company, the Carnegie Steel Company, and he borrowed a lot of these ideas from Bessemer, who I think Bessemer had a nickname originally. They called him the Man of Steel, like Superman. You know about this? He was one of the first to make steel, mass produce it. And so Carnegie over time developed bigger steel plants, and after Carnegie sold his company, that led to the development of U.S. Steel, United States Steel Corporation, which I think was the first billion-dollar corporation, which was developed by J.P. Morgan. I think I was at the turn of the 20th century when they developed that. But for a long time, Pittsburgh, cities like that, Birmingham, Alabama, were considered, up to like at least the 1970s, they produced the most steel in the world. Birmingham is famous for like Sloss furnaces, you may have heard of, where they produced a lot of these steel mills before. A lot of the closed down now or rusting away. But that's because of the fact that, in these foreign countries like China and whatever, they can produce steel a lot cheaper. In fact, China produces 10 times the more amount of steel than we do today, to give you kind of an idea. But steel's pretty important. Steel, is very vital, of course, in the making of, whether it's, skyscrapers, bridges, railroads, locomotives, cars, automobiles, things like that. Those are things that are, kind of important with that. Now, I'm going to talk about some other things. I'm going to kind of get into some other inventions that were kind of big. I'll kind of get more into the second industrial revolution, which is like between the 19th and the 20th century, where you have a lot of different inventions that kind of come along. The big things they had was telecommunication. Like you look at the late 19th century, that was the big thing that happened, where the telegraph was invented. That really took off by the late 1800s. Telephone by the 1870s, wireless telegraph, I think at least by the 1890s as well. So those are all inventions that were pretty big at one point. And of course, the telephone's still around today. Telegraph not really used much anymore, but obviously wireless radio is still used, of course. Kind of look at this here, but these are some famous inventors that were well known in the whole telecommunications thing. You've got Samuel Morse, who you see on the right in the middle in that picture. He was an American that really helped to advance the telegraph industry. in the United States. I think they talk about him and Charles Wheatstone in England that helped to develop it. He developed one of the first major telegraphs in the United States in 1832. Of course, the famous inventor of Morse code with that. Morse was famous for sending the first actual telegraph message, May 24th, 1844, when he sent the message in a question, "What hath God wrought?" And so that's a famous quote there. And so that's kind of why he got all these medals, later, because other countries were kind of influenced by him with the basically with that. And I think I've got images showing where is it, the famous Morse code alphabet. Of course, that's also used. And for a long time, telegraph operators were considered cutting edge. They were like computer wizards or whatever today, back in the day in the 19th century. And knowing all this, Morse code and all that. Now, I guess a lot of people know now, but very few people knew what that was. But also, you got Guglielmo Marconi, which you see on the left. Marconi was an Italian American, came from Italy originally, and he helped popularize, of course, wireless telegraph in the 19th century, because they started to figure out that they could send radio waves to send messages, and so that led to the development of also radio over time. And Marconi was known for his own company that he would develop called the Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company. And if you sent like a message through his company, it was called a Marconigram. So that's something he's kind of known for overall. And you have companies that start developing after that. Like you may have heard of Western Union, right? They also are another company that kind of develops, that kind of is involved in the telegraph industry as well. They say that was considered one of the first corporations up there with U.S. Steel that developed mostly in the United States overall. You may have heard of this other man I did want to talk about. Let me say, I'll kind of get to, there, of course, is a Marconi, by the way, another one, 1903. That was, he was one of the first to send the first transatlantic wireless message, which was sent on January 19th, 1903, when basically a message was sent between the King of Britain and, of course, Teddy Roosevelt. I think Roosevelt sent that to the king. And so that's something that's quite interesting. I think also they say that 1912, when the Titanic went down, if you know about this, they sent one of the first ship-to-ship wireless messages, SOS, you know about that. And so that was kind of because of Marconi. And so because of that, some people were, saved, but a lot of people died, when the Titanic went down. Of course, you may have heard of Nikola Tesla. He was big too by the late 19th century. Tesla was the Serbian American that came to the United States, who originally worked for Thomas Edison, but he kind of broke from Edison. And he was known for electrical and mechanical engineering. And the reason why Tesla's well known is because he's the one that really influenced a lot of our electrical supply. He's the one that was the brains behind the idea of using alternating current with electricity. And he and this man you may have heard of named George Westinghouse in the United States, of course, developed Westinghouse Electric Corporation, which is still around today. And they fought Edison over this thing, over what kind of electrical current to use, either, alternating current versus direct current. And over time, they went with alternating current, which is more safer than direct current. So that's because of Tesla. They have cars named after him, Tesla, as you know, electric cars. And so that's something he's kind of famous for name-wise overall. Not sure what you think of electric car, but I'm sure you think it would be pretty cool, I guess. Of course, telephone, of course, another invention. Alexander Graham Bell is a Canadian American, originally who, of course, was known for developing the telephone, which he developed in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in 1876. Most people do not know this, but Bell originally developed the telephone to be used in education to help out deaf students who can't hear. And so they were supposed to, I guess, put it up to their ears so they could hear the teacher. And you realize that it could be used for a telecommunication thing. And so Bell went on to invent it. And then from there, if you know what happened, Bell then monopolized it. And he developed the, Bell Telephone Company. He created right after in the 1870s, which is now called AT&T, if you know about that. But this kind of had different names that they've called it, or they broke it up later because it was a monopoly at one point. But AT&T is one of the main derivatives, of course, of Bell. Bell South and all these other names you've heard of course. So, yeah, I guess the telephone is obviously the most famous invention, I guess, telecommunications that really changed everything, worldwide. Yeah, I usually talk about the airplane. A lot of these inventions are, get more into the end of the, industrial revolution, closer to World War One and all that. But yeah, the airplane is considered really one of the most famous inventions, really, in the second industrial revolution. The airplane is important because it really revolutionized transportation, not just in commercial avionics, but obviously in warfare, right? Of course, in wars, because you know, obviously, fighters and bombers were developed from that, of course, idea later. And I don't know if you know much about the Wright brothers. The Wright brothers were originally from Ohio, and Orville and Wilbur Wright, and they were actually famous for being bicycle mechanics and manufacturers, like making bicycles. Because if you know about the late 19th century, bicycles became real popular in Europe and the United States. But what happened was the Wright brothers heard about gliders in Europe. Now they were starting to develop gliders, and I guess they realized they could try to fly these contraptions from also studying birds as well. And so the Wright brothers first used gliders, and they put engines with propellers on them. And so in December 1903, you can see that they flew the first plane, like into flight, first flight, of course, you see there, which I think they call it the Wright Flyer or Wright Flyer 1. I think is usually considered one of the first planes that they flew at in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, on the eastern coast, because it's real windy there, and so that was a great location to actually, fly it. Later, they had other versions like the Wright Flyer 2, Wright Flyer 3, and a few others that they had. I think it was a A and a B. I thought they built later as well. And they sold these to the U.S. Army, and I think later they also they actually brought some to Europe and showed the Europeans, and the Europeans were influenced by the Wright brothers as well to also develop airplanes. So by World War One, within about 10 years or so, airplanes are going to start to be used in combat pretty quickly. You can see they have like biplanes, triplanes, and things like that. But over time, they'll go to like a mono type plane with only one single wing. Yeah, the automobile is another big invention that really revolutionized transportation, starting in the Industrial Revolution. The automobile was not invented in the United States. It was invented in Germany back in the 19th century. Mercedes-Benz was really one of the first companies or corporations that developed automobiles. Their automobiles are kind of some of the best in the world, as you know. They kind of over-engineer them, if you know about that. The Germans, they over-engineer everything, the Germans. But anyway, but the automobile is something that really changed everything to revolutionize, transportation, because obviously wherever there's roads, you can go anywhere, even on your own timetable. You don't have to worry about when the next train is or when the next bus is coming and things like that. But They say that they always talk about the Ford Motor Company as being one of the first that really advanced or revolutionized transportation, especially in America. Henry Ford was one of the first to really mass produce automobiles by the millions, which one of the first automobiles that they mass produced was the Model T, which was first produced in 1908. You see in that middle of that picture. And I think between 1909 to 1927, 27 million Model Ts were actually built. That's a lot. And if you know about the Model T, it had a nickname. It was called the Tin Lizzie because it was kind of like almost like a tin can on wheels, but it was cheap. I think you could get it for like, I want to say, under $1,000. It was kind of expensive at that time still, but a lot of people, especially in the Roaring '20s, began buying a lot of them. And so that's something that Henry Ford was kind of known for. Ford, you can see, was also known for being one of the first to use assembly lines, which the idea was something that he got from, believe it or not, he got it from Thomas Edison, who kind of manufactured things that way. And his workers, by the way, Ford Motor Company was one of the first major companies to not only, have assembly lines, but they also paid their workers pretty good, $5 a day in the early 1900s, which was pretty good back then. But basically, with assembly lines, they would begin to manufacture automobiles like that's the 1927 Model T, where workers would basically build only a section of the car. So you wouldn't build the whole car yourself. Your job might be just to put the steering wheel on or something like that, or put the tires on or wheels on, whatever, or one guy would paint it. And so that's basically how they manufacture not just automobiles, but a lot of things are manufactured that way, like on an assembly line. Obviously, Detroit, Michigan, that area, the United States is an area where they produce a lot of automobiles later, of course, which they still do. Here's some more automobiles, of course, you're looking at. Of course, those are back in the early 1900s, probably being invented, but built. But yeah, I will also talk about Thomas Edison for a few minutes. This is more American stuff, but yeah, Edison is considered really one of the greatest, most prolific inventors, especially in the second industrial revolution, that really innovated a lot of things. And Edison was this American inventor. I believe he was from Ohio originally, but he was famous for patenting like hundreds and hundreds of inventions, which really changed everybody's lives. Improved everybody's lives between the 19th and the 20th century. And he even had this inventor's workshop that he created in New Jersey in the town of Menlo Park. It was kind of like an inventor's workshop. And he and his scientists or workers would develop basically new kinds of inventions. And part of why if you know much about Thomas Edison, he was known as the Wizard of Menlo Park. He got this nickname because a lot of people thought that his inventions were magic, but they were not. They were a lot hard work that went into it. And I think if you know much about Edison, he would remark famous quotes like, he said something like, "My inventions are 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration." Or I think he said, "I didn't invent the battery. I invented ways not to invent the battery," because they invented just so many ways that failed when they invented things and stuff like that. I think with a filament in their light bulb, I think it was like cotton filament or something they used eventually over time, but it took them different methods to find different filaments that would work on things like that. Oh, these are some things he invented I got them listed on there. Of course, the incandescent light bulb. That's considered the most famous invention, really, he created, which lights were around, like in Europe, like in Paris and other cities. They had like early lights, like arc lights, etc. I know Tesla helped develop and things like different lights and so on. Electric light power. So you start to see cities being lit up. I know Edison was one of the first to develop electric light power for New York City. He even had his own company, the Thomas Edison Electric Company, which is now called, as you know, if you know much about, is now called General Electric. GE is basically was originally created by Edison. The phonograph, the movie projector, those are all inventions that Edison first created initially. Microscope, kinetoscope is another type of invention he created. He had like an electric vote recorder. I think was another thing he had. The mimeograph machine, if you know what that is a type of machine to make copies, like a Xerox copy machine. He was one of the first to do that. Automatic telegraph machine where you could send multiple. I think he had one machine where you could send 4 telegraph messages at the same time. He had different kinds of batteries he invented. He even had his own cement company he created. But like I said, he helped found General Electric. It's something that he's kind of known for overall. Oh, here's a famous quote he said. I never view mistakes as failures. They are simply opportunities to find out what doesn't work. So that's some interesting quote there in the process he went by. And he, by the way, if you know much about Edison, he was notorious for being a workaholic. He would just work for hours, take a cat nap, and then go back to work. So he was around up to the early 1900s making inventions. Now, I wanted to move on next. I wanted to talk for a few minutes about the topic of socialism, which is kind of a controversial topic, because of the rise of communism, which is kind of well known. But socialism is something that really started in the 1800s, like mid 1800s, roughly, which they think a lot of it was caused by the fact that the Industrial Revolution wasn't kind of catching up to workers' demands. Like workers wanted better wages and better working conditions and things like that. And there were starting to be economic booms in the 1800s, but it wasn't really translating to what the workers, wanted or demanded. And so you had problems like, obviously things like, I'll kind of give you examples of things, but like workers' wages were not, obviously enough to what they wanted. You had all these, capitalists that were making a lot of money on various industries, getting very wealthy. Working conditions were real bad. So that was something. They didn't have unions. They couldn't unionize. Things like that were other problems. No health insurance, no workers' compensation. So those were things that workers had to deal with in those days. If you were a skilled worker, you might make about $1 to $3 a day was the average. If you're unskilled, probably half that. To give you an idea of the different, wages a long time ago. So socialists demanded basically that the economy be more centralized and run either by the government, like centralized government planning, or run by the actual people itself. So that's the whole idea of what socialism really is in a nutshell. But I'll get to it later. It is kind of controversial because there's no actual clear method of what socialism really is, because you have different variations of it that evolve over time. The one that we hate and dread is communism, which was the more radical version, of course. That's there. Industrialists were often called, I know in America they called them robber barons, I think was the term they used, which were some of the early capitalists that were around, which used unscrupulous means to basically further their industries, develop them, and make as much money as possible. And so that was over, obviously, the interests of what the workers wanted, what their demands were, better wages, of course, and better conditions and all that. I'll get to it first, but you have early socialism that develops predominantly in Europe. You have what they call utopian socialism that starts really in countries like England, France. I think there's a theory that socialism started really out of the French Revolution a long time ago, back in the 1800s. And utopian socialists favored this idea that common ownership of property and things should be, controlled by the people, ownership of land, ownership of factories, and things like that. They believed in also government planning when it comes to economics overall. So most of it began predominantly in um, France, England, also, yes, United States as well. Some people also call it cooperative socialism, is another brand name they use, which a lot of it was mostly in either small farming communities or also industrial towns, was also another method that they used. And those were famous early socialists that were considered utopian, like Robert Owen, Charles Fourier, and Count Saint Simon. I think so they say it. And they basically, the reason why they call it utopian is because of the fact that it was considered to be like this um, perfect city or perfect, society where everybody lived in harmony. And later, I think the Marxists, like Karl Marx, of course, kind of saw it as not possible to do this. But you do have like examples, like I know in America they had several that were kind of well known that developed. Like New Harmony was an example that was in Indiana, where it was like this utopian, like industrial town that they kind of tried to develop under a man you may have heard of named Owen. And anyway, yeah, yeah. I think I've mentioned about him. Uh, yeah, Robert Owen is an example of one who kind of developed that idea, but I think it failed. If you know about this, but the idea of having like these industrialized cities or towns is something you see later. Like in America, you have like coal towns or whatever that they create as an example. Brook Farm, I think, is another one. Oneida Society, I think those are famous ones that are kind of well known. I know Oneida Society was up in upstate New York. You heard about that? And it later is known for making like silverware in, you know, plates and cups and stuff like that, like porcelain or whatever. But later you get like Karl Marx by the mid part of the 19th century. Karl Marx really was the one that changed really socialism in the 19th and 20th century. Marx, of course, was a German philosopher who was really well known for a lot of his works like the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. And I want to first go ahead and start. I want to show you a little short documentary on his life to give you kind of an idea of who Marx was.
Twain is now thought of as America's first celebrity because he was so good at capturing the public imagination, and it became important to him to have a public image.
A little short video there, of course, on Karl Marx, who, of course, changed socialism. So socialism, if you study about it, basically replaced utopian socialism, which Marxism is kind of like a scientific variation of socialism, which were based on the philosophies of Marx and also Engels as well, who helped write the Communist Manifesto, which came out in 1848. And I think I've got an image showing the two together. They did collaborate a lot, writing various works, of course, similar to socialism. And one thing about Marx, he believed that a lot of it, part of why capitalism, he thought capitalism would over time decline, maybe even collapse, believe it or not, due to an internal struggle that's kind of going on between the different social classes, like upper versus the lower classes. And so, if you know about Marx, he divided basically in socialism, he divided people into two main classes. If you know about this, which is the capitalists, which are the bourgeoisie, these ones that control all the capital, like the factories or invest in the factories, et cetera, industries. And these were people that came out of the upper middle class, which we talked about before. And the workers are the proletariat. They're the ones that basically are the working class that work for wages. And so Marx believed that what would happen over time, why capitalism would fail, would be to a wealth gap between the two, where the inequities between the upper class and the lower classes would lead the lower classes, the workers, to overthrow the upper, and then create some kind of socialist type state afterwards. And so that's the theory of how it worked out. And his idea of communism was supposed to be a classless, stateless society where there's no money, that kind of thing. If you know about it, everybody's equal, etc. Over time, his ideas, by the way, would spread, like they said. One of the first nations in the world that became a socialist type state, of course, was the Soviet Union, which that happened really, I guess, from the Russian Revolution in 1917. But over time, I guess it wasn't really founded until 1922, officially after the Russian Civil War, which took place, which was probably pretty bloody, if you know about that. And it was based on what they call Marxism-Leninism, which was a style of Marxism that was based off of kind of a combination of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin's idea, who was a famous Russian socialist and communist. And the only thing different about their brand of socialism, it was more totalitarian. You know about it. Where the whole state was pretty much a one-party state, socialist type state. And over time, Lenin and Stalin become these totalitarian dictators that controlled it. And I think Stalin is kind of known for developing Stalinism, where the idea is to create communism within one state instead of, I know initially they were going to try to spread it all over the world or whatever. That's basically in a nutshell, what they were trying to do. You see here, well, I think Lenin once said that the goal of socialism is communism, that over time, that's the goal of it, even though it might be democratic or capitalist even, but the end goal of socialism is to eventually become communistic over time. These are the countries later that they consider to be like the main communist countries throughout the world. Of course, obviously, Soviet Union was one of the first we just talked about. These are others that, of course, are founded later. North Korea, then People's Republic of China, you can see came next. Cuba as well. And then, of course, you've also got Laos. Don't forget North Vietnam, which later becomes Vietnam. But those are all considered countries that are maybe considered to be somewhat communist still today. Although China's economy is looking more capitalist, but their government's kind of communist in that sense. Of course, today you do have what they call social democracy. That's the kind of more popular form of socialism that kind of took off later, which is really more capitalism, if you know about that. You can see the differences between socialism versus social democracy. Social democracy embraces the use of democracy and capitalism. Is what it really does. So they're kind of trying to create more fair market economies within capitalism. But there's a lot of government planning that kind of goes into it. Obviously, like about like in Scandinavia, they have the Nordic model, which has become very popular. Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, even have that kind of brand of socialism, really social democracy, which is really capitalism. But then you've got like the United States. We have mostly capitalism, although some people refer to it as being called welfare capitalism. You want to call it that way as well, which has some similarities to social democracy, but it's more capitalistic, where some social welfare is put into like programs like in the government and business and things like that. And that might be some universal health care, somewhat, like Medicare, Medicaid, that kind of thing. You've heard of retirement benefits through companies or whatever, pensions, social care, or Social Security also as well. is another thing that they're well known for as well. So anyway, that's kind of an idea of what, so socialism will later be, something big later when we get to the 20th century. You'll see the rise of like the Soviet Union, which communism, the one that people hate, like in Europe primarily, Asia and all that, it obviously resulted in a lot of people being killed. I think they say that maybe communism killed 100 million people or something like that worldwide because of its strict policies. Because some countries like Soviet Union, if you didn't follow what they wanted, they either killed you or they sent you like the gulag, if you know about that. So you had that kind of going on as well. But predominantly in the West, we're pretty much strictly capitalist, or with some socialist twist to it, I guess. But anyway, before I go, I did want to remind you about assignments. Don't forget, I still got the first exam out. You ought to kind of y'all need to wrap that up this week and get that out the way, because you do need to move on to work on that British quiz, wrap that up, and the second exam, like in the middle of the semester, get that out the way, because we're getting closer to the end of the semester. We have like 2-3 weeks left of the semester. And then you got the second vocab. That's due by the weekend. I'll probably give you a few extra days on that, but y'all need to get that done too, also as well. So this will conclude, by the way, the lecture material for the second exam. The second exam is going to have French Revolution, Age of Napoleon, and the first two lectures on the 19th century that I have. Tomorrow I'll send out an email today. I will have a recorded lecture I'll have on the 19th century. I'll kind of wrap up on, I'll kind of go into like the rise of imperialism and a few other things like nationalism, which that'll go on a separate quiz later, but probably World War I. So, because next week I'll be getting into talking about the 20th century. So that's it, live lectures for the week. But y'all have a great rest of the week, of course. And I'll of course see you later. So y'all take care and have a great one.